Welcome to episode 6 of Healthy Living with the Bourgeois. This episode is all about heart health, and in particular, atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. Now, the reason we wanted to do an episode on this topic is it's estimated that 80% of the incidences of cardiovascular disease are preventable through healthy behaviors. But the trick with achieving that prevention is starting as early as possible. So as a young couple in our 20s, this is something that we're really focused on and that we're doing things in our life to try to achieve. Now, this episode was actually filmed a couple of months ago when we were just sort of practicing and getting comfortable with the idea of doing a podcast. So let's throw it back to Jesse and Chantel from a couple of months ago. Enjoy the episode.
Today's episode is going to be on heart health, and we're going to bring you along with why it's been important to us lately. So we're going to do a bit of a quick overview. Jesse's going to give that to us right now.
Yeah, so heart health is something that has been sort of particular interest to us lately, and something that I've been reading a lot into and just spending more time learning about. And it's for a few different reasons, but the first reason is, so I'm a kinesiologist. I did my schooling in the stream of clinical exercise physiology, and in that they have a lot of courses around sort of these various medical conditions and how they relate to physical activity in general. And during that time, of course, we talk about these sort of the big three. So cardiovascular related diseases, cancer, and neurodegenerative related diseases. And during that, they talked about heart disease in such a way that it did pique my interest, and it was something that I was curious about. But we never really got into the nitty-gritty details around sort of like prevalence and what risk factors are associated with it. It was more around how do you work with somebody who has cardiovascular disease, which makes sense given that's what you're in schooling for, is to understand how to work with these people. So when I finished my degree and I started working as a kinesiologist, I had a string of clients that were all people who had experienced a stroke. And one of the things that was kind of interesting about it was all but one were men. And it made it hit home a little bit more because heart disease is a lot more common for men than it is for women. At least the onset of it is typically a lot earlier for men than for women. And what made it sort of really kind of hit my heart was watching that not only was it a struggle for the individual who had experienced the stroke, but it was also completely changed the relationship that they had with their partners. Because what I would see is that it was their wives that were bringing them to the sessions, and most of my conversations were with their partners around, you know, how it had changed their plans, that they had wanted all the things they wanted to do in retirement, and you know, what their wives could be doing in order to support them with the rehabilitation process at home and all of these things. And it was when you and I sort of first started talking and reconnecting, and it's just so in my mind of like, this is something that I so don't want to do to you and to put you through. So that was something that was kind of made it of particular interest. And then, so that was about 5 years ago now. And since then, I've spent time kind of just reading and researching and reviewing research around this topic. And then just recently, I've kind of really dived into it a bit more. And part of the reason why was just starting to really, it finally clicked, the prevalence and how this whole disease works. And it's funny because give the profession that I'm in and the schooling that I had, you would think that would have clicked sooner, but it really didn't. So I figured, and one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about it on this platform and kind of just share this is that if it didn't click for me, there's probably others that it didn't click with very much as well. Because like for you, for example, like how has anyone ever relayed the risk of heart disease to you? Is it ever something that you thought of, hey, I need to work on this while I'm young?
No, since that's like the first time we've actually like talked about it.
Right.
Growing up, we never really talked about heart health.
Yeah, and it's not a common thing. You get some of the public health messaging that is associated with it, but typically we don't like explicitly say it. Like there's a lot of directed at young people to be, physically active, to avoid smoking, to, have low alcohol consumption and all of these different pieces. But it's not that common that we actually realize, a big piece of that is in order to protect our heart as we get older. So I'm just going to go through a couple kind of prevalence statistics just to sort of give some context to why this is such an important piece. But heart disease is the leading cause of death globally. It's the second leading cause of death in Canada, just behind cancer. But if we look at, there's a thing called a DALY, or a disability adjusted life year, which is a calculation that combines years of life lost with years lived with a disability. And the point of that calculation is to measure the burden that a disease is causing a population. So it can help sort of direct priorities when it comes to public health and these different things, but it really sort of captures the picture of what's causing the biggest burden to this population. Because, I've heard it been said before of like, yes, heart disease is a thing, but if you're dying of a heart attack when you're 100, you gotta die of something. And like it kind of reduces the impact or the significance of the impact that has on the population. So I think it's really important to remember that when we look at this DALY score, what's giving the most burden to Canadian citizens as a population basis regarding their health is heart disease by a long shot. That's what's causing the biggest burden to Canadians' health. So it's just something that to sort of keep in mind. And with that, so 1 in 12 Canadians over the age of 20 is diagnosed with heart disease. And that number seems high, but what's really interesting about that is that heart disease is a process that takes a really long time. And we'll talk a little bit about that. So that 1 in 12 is missing a lot of individuals because a lot of people have heart disease and don't know it yet. And their first incidents, how they find out that they have heart disease a lot of times is having a heart attack. So it's kind of an interesting topic to look at statistics on and how they're capturing that. And that's why I like that DALY. I think it does a really good job of sort of giving us an idea of like, hey, this is a huge problem, because it is one of those things where so many people likely have it and just have no idea. So, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, what age does it start at then?
So that's one of the really fascinating things is that heart disease can start basically when you're an infant, but even in utero. So there's been cases of babies who have died as a fetus. And if the mother had a really high saturated fat diet and had other associated risk factors of developing heart disease, that those babies actually have remnants of the starting process of heart disease. So like this starts at the beginning. And we've seen that where, children that have tragically passed away very young also have these signs when autopsied of developing heart disease. Lots of soldiers, what really sort of shined a light on this happening at a really young age was soldiers coming back from, I believe it was World War I, that were getting autopsied, realizing that they already had lots of platy streaks in their arteries. And these are 20-year-olds. So this is something that starts really young. It just might not have significant symptoms attached to it until you get older, which is a huge problem because that means when you're addressing the disease, you're already,
so much worse.
You're so far into the disease process that it's going to be much harder to deal with. One way that I've heard other people describe it, physicians describe it, is it's kind of like investing. If you start investing in your 20s, you can invest a smaller amount, and that compounding interest and the amount that you invest over those years and years and years and years and years will help set you up for success and financial success in retirement. If you don't start investing until you're in your 50s for retirement, you have to invest a lot more intensely, a lot more aggressively, and potentially a little bit more risk associated with it. And usually what they're capturing there is, statins are incredible. They've done an amazing job for our society in helping prevent sort of the incidence of mortality related events with cardiovascular disease. But there's always risk when it comes to taking a drug or something to reduce a disease process. So it sort of captures the fact of like, you can be less aggressive with your prevention strategy if you start younger, and there's less risk because it's physical activity, diet, stress management, sleep, all of these things that don't have these other associated risks with it. So I really liked that explanation. I think it captures it quite well. And I think, so with that early intervention piece and that this disease takes such a long time, it might be worthwhile just explaining a little bit about how heart disease comes to be.
Absolutely.
And before we do that, I guess want to sort of pause and just disclaimer this. So this is something that I'm interested in. And like I mentioned, I'm a kinesiologist, but that by no means make me an expert in this area or someone who should be giving medical advice in association with this or anything like that. This is solely just for entertainment purposes and something that we find interesting just as ordinary people who are trying to live a healthy life. So talk to your physician before you make any sort of dietary, physical activity, other lifestyle related changes if you're worried about your heart health, and definitely ask them questions, and what they say is going to be of a lot higher quality and accuracy than what I'm saying here. So talk to your physician. Disclaimer, not experts, non-experts, just reading interesting information. So we'll give the sort of overview of how heart disease starts. So heart disease is a blanket term. There's multiple conditions that are within that. What I'm talking about is atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, so ASCVD. It's also termed as coronary artery disease, but atherosclerosis is this process of arteries hardening and plaques forming within the arteries. That's what we're talking about here. Different than like congenital heart failure and some of these other things. And what can happen with that is these plaques start to build up, and then when the soft plaque can break away, and if it, totally clogs, then it restricts blood from getting back to the heart, and you have what's called a myocardial infarction or a heart attack. If that happens and it blocks blood from getting to the brain, it's sort of a heart attack of the brain or a stroke, one type of a stroke. And that can also happen on the lower extremities. So you might block and not get blood flow to your legs or something, and then that can have complications resulting in an amputation or something else. So not good, not something that you want to have happen. And how that process happens, how arteries start to get clogged up with this plaquey, waxy substance, is where cholesterol comes into the picture. So most people have heard there's good cholesterol and bad cholesterol. HDL cholesterol is the good cholesterol, LDL cholesterol is the bad cholesterol. And that's kind of technically not correct. The cholesterol part is the exact same. It's just cholesterol. What makes the difference are these things called lipoproteins. And that's what the HDL, high density lipoprotein, and the LDL, low density lipoprotein, that's what they're talking about. That's what makes the difference in one being good and one being bad, is these lipoproteins. And just as the name sounds, lipo, so lipid is just another word for fat. So they're lipid proteins. They sort of carry fat where it needs to go. Cholesterol is the people, the lipoproteins are the car. They're the ones that are actually sort of moving these things through the bloodstream. And the reason for that is cholesterol, being a fat, doesn't mix well with water, which is what our blood mainly is. It's just water. Think of if you pour cooking oil into a pot of water, it separates right away. It's hard for it to get around. So that's where these lipoproteins come into play. They move the cholesterol through the bloodstream, and they're very complicated. It is lipidology as a field is fascinating. And when I try to read some of the research papers or listen to the professionals talk, it's so fascinating. So I by no means know the ins and outs of this. And if you get the opportunity ever to talk to, your physician would have lots of really good information, but someone who's kind of specifically spent time in that field would just be the coolest thing to pick their brain about all of this, because it's complicated, but basically the main difference between these things, why LDL is sort of termed the bad and HDL is termed the good, is that these low density lipoproteins are actually physically larger, but they have these other proteins that are attached to them. It's not just sort of one thing. There's a lot of complexity going on. And these other proteins that are on this vehicle end up getting stuck into the artery walls and sort of depositing the cholesterol into the artery wall. And it kicks off this immune system sort of inflammatory cascade where macrophages inside of the artery wall and so on and so forth. A bunch of stuff happens. But there's this inflammatory process, and that's not good. It ends up causing these sort of fatty streaks and plaques to start forming inside of the artery wall. HDL, on the other hand, does not. It doesn't seem to do that. And there's a lot of complexity with HDL where, for a long time, there was this idea that as long as the ratio was good, that it wasn't too big of an issue. So if LDL was high, but your HDL was also high, maybe that means that your risk is a bit lower. And again, obviously talk to your doctor about your risk, but that turned out to not necessarily be the case. It had a lot more to do with the number of these LDL particles within the blood, not so much with this ratio. And there's reasons for that are we're not going to get into. But if you're interested, let us know, because we'll do a part 2 of this and I will just nerd out as hard as I can and we can get into all the details. And yeah, it'll be fun. So if you're interested in this and you want to know a little bit more, let me know. Just even the story of how cholesterol began getting studied and different things is really neat. But the gist of it is this LDL is bad. You don't want to have a lot of LDL in your system, LDL cholesterol in your system, particularly the particles of LDL. The cholesterol itself isn't necessarily the problem. So that's how this process all starts. If you have a lifetime of high LDL and it's making these deposits into the artery wall all through your life, that's what we're talking about. That's why it's such a long process to develop this disease. And there's different genetic factors and different things that either speed up that process or make that process go slower. But the nice thing with that is that at this point, because this is such a big issue, it gets studied a lot, we know that there's modifiable factors associated with this. And we'll link to the American Heart Association has this Essential 8 document that talks about the 8 modifiable risk factors. And it's fantastic. It details out what you can do for all of these different factors. And we'll also talk about them a little bit here. But that's sort of the overview of sort of heart disease, into the basics of cholesterol, and that there are some things that we can do about it.
Did you talk about heart disease at all growing up? Is this all like within the past 5 years?
Yeah, pretty much. I can't think of thinking of even like high school health class, all of those types of things. I can't think of any time that it was specifically talked about, not to my recollection. And even in that time, I was into fitness and sports and all of that stuff during that time, but it was never something that I can think of was ever really talked about by really anybody. And I don't remember ever seeing it in messaging either, directed to
it's fascinating, because I didn't know that it actually started in childhood. Since talking to you, we've been deep diving, and it's so fascinating, and I think it's very surprising that it's not talked about more. Because if that's the case, then you'd want to get on top of things when your children or whatever, when they're little, right? It's interesting.
Yeah, it's one of those things, and that's part of the reason why I wanted to do this. This is obviously you want to take these actions for yourself and make sure that you're doing things that are going to reduce your risk long term. But it's also something that you can, if you have kids, if you start this now, you can set them up for, greater success in their life as well. One side note, just as before we kind of keep rocking and rolling with this, if you ever see us looking around randomly around the room, or the camera just shakes all of a sudden and it's what is happening over on that side of the camera? Gus is our dog, is just doing his thing amongst the house while we do this. He just dragged one of his toys across the room. So just so you know, just so we don't look like crazy people.
Yeah. Okay, let's dive into some questions here. What can ordinary people like us do? And let's talk about nutrition, physical activity, and lifestyle. So let's start with nutrition.
Yeah, that sounds great. And those are really good ways of sort of categorizing these sort of modifiable risk factors. Nutrition? Yeah, nutrition. Okay. So nutrition is a good one to start with because it's probably where a lot of us have heard things, and where a lot of I think it's safe to say bad information just exists, unfortunately, whether it's on social media or, your uncle who comes over at dinner that tells you some new diet trend is the best thing since sliced bread. So I think there's a lot of room for improvement in that area, and maybe some things that people don't know. So nutrition is really cool because nutrition directly impacts that level of LDL that is in our bloodstream through a variety of different ways. So it's something that we can, make a pretty big influence on our overall risk. And the neat thing is that it's really not overly complicated. What we tend to see, what all the kind of large major organizations point to, so like American Heart Association, Canadian Heart and Stroke Foundation, European Society of Cardiology, and the associated journals that publish research within these organizations. What they tend to point to is the Mediterranean diet, which is the king of research of nutrition. It always pops up as being beneficial for health, kind of whatever you're talking about, which we can get into that maybe another time, but there's a lot of reasons why that's the case. The portfolio diet, which some people may not be as familiar with, but it's out of researchers out of Canada, actually, which is really cool. And plant-based dietary patterns, as well as like the DASH diet, which is for blood pressure, but it overlaps. There's common themes. So it has been shown to be beneficial for cholesterol, or this LDL that's in the bloodstream as well, and associated outcomes. It's also really important to note. Outcome data is really important. You actually want to see that there is a reduced number of cardiovascular events, so strokes and heart attacks and things like that, associated with these diets. Not just that LDL goes down, because biology is complicated. Sometimes something can move and it doesn't actually change the outcome. These actually change the outcome, which is really important. So it's really neat to see that, because what the common trend between all those different dietary patterns is it's low in saturated fat and it's high in fiber. There's other sort of nuance to that, but sorry, Gus is wandering about again. There's other nuance to that, but that's a really good summary and a really good place to start. And we can get into maybe some more specifics in upcoming podcasts. But if you reduce your saturated fat and increase your fiber intake, that's going to really help move this needle in the right direction. And something that's important to consider with that is understanding what foods have those different things, right? So if we think of saturated fat, it's foods that become solid, fats that become solid at room temperature are typically saturated fats. And one way that you can categorize it is it's like tropical oils and fats from animal food sources, with some exclusion to fish. Fish has saturated fat, but not very much, which kind of highlights why the Mediterranean diet always pops up, right? Tons of plant-based foods, and the main animal-based protein source is fish, right? So that's one of the reasons why that one tends to pop up as being something beneficial. So it's worth to kind of think about, because your highest amount of saturated fat from a animal food source is going to be things like red meat, which is why we're seeing, like in the States, heart disease is the number one killer in the States. And it could be partially associated because there's a lot of red meat consumption in the States and a lot of developed countries. So that's something to keep in mind, is that sort of the further you go away from red meat, typically the lower the saturated fat. So something like poultry would have a little bit less, and then fish even a little bit less. But like things like pork, steak, all of those types of things that are red meat tend to have more saturated fat. And obviously the fattier the cut of meat, the more animal fat that's in it, right? Dairy is also relatively high in saturated fat. That's the main sort of type of fat that's in dairy products. And then things like coconut oil and stuff like that. So the more we reduce those things in our diet, typically the better. That starts to also make sense why a plant-based diet falls into that category, right? It's just sort of obvious. You have no animal products in there, so a lot of those saturated fat components go away. It's one of the reasons why a lot of people sort of raised a red flag when all the coconut oil stuff was going on, of put it in your coffee, put it in your smoothies, because it was like, even people on plant-based diets now potentially could have this high intake of saturated fat where normally they wouldn't, because normally people aren't using that much coconut oil.
In their coffee. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's nice to see that trend is starting to kind of go away.
Yeah.
And the portfolio diet, which some people might not be as familiar with, and I think we'll do a podcast just about the portfolio diet because it is something that, not as many people are familiar with. But it puts a lot of emphasis on like nuts and seeds, fiber intake, plant protein sources, that type of thing. But the goal of it was inclusion rather than exclusion. So rather than like plant-based is often defined as what you can't eat. Like you're not eating animal products, you're not having dairy, that type of thing. The portfolio diet was more like get this number of these foods in your diet. Whatever makes up the rest isn't as much of a focus. Yeah, so portfolio diet, Mediterranean diet, plant-based diet. General thing is you're lowering saturated fat consumption and you're increasing fiber. The fiber conversation can get a little bit of nuance within it of like insoluble fibers versus soluble fibers and that type of thing. For the everyday person, like it really doesn't matter. Just eat a lot of fiber. If you get some like green bananas or if you cook some potatoes or rice or something and let it cool and then reheat and eat it, or eat it cold, bonus, because there's some specific fibers that are in those types of foods. So don't shy away from your leftovers. But that's kind of the general nutrition theme.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm going to jump in for a second. So like you said at the beginning, there's a lot on social media that's complete opposite. And certain people have millions of followers and their content is so far from what you should be doing.
Right.
Everything you just said, it's complete opposite, but they have so many views and so many followers. Where can the average Joe go to do proper research? Like where have you found like actually legit research on this stuff because I mean, research is hard and like you have to find the right stuff and like go down the right rabbit hole, right? So is there like maybe you can link a few things where we all can go on and actually find the truth and things?
Yeah, and so let's unpack that just a little bit. 100%, we can link some stuff below. It is really challenging because this is a really good example because like the carnivore trend and some of this stuff is really kicking off, and even keto kind of fell into this where there's short-term subjective benefits that are 100% true. If you're eating a carnivore-esque diet, it's very likely you're going to lose weight. It's very likely you're going to initially feel better because it's kind of an exclusion-based diet, right? So if anything is causing you any sort of, GI distress or anything like that, it's an elimination diet sort of by default. And there are numerous health benefits and subjective benefits of feeling good that come along with weight loss. And that's often what was the research started to find with stuff like keto and these different things was that most of the benefits are just associated with weight loss. Now, why that becomes a problem is that it's a trade-off. Like you're getting one benefit, but then you're reducing risk in one way, but then you're increasing risk in another way. Because of course, like there are health benefits that come with weight loss, but the part to pay attention to is that there's better ways of going about doing it. And a lot of the claims and the things that are promoted, it's like, yes, it can get these sort of short-term benefits, but you want to play the long game. And that's one of the things that's really challenging is like, for people our age and for others that are young, and it's hard to keep that in mind where it's like you kind of want that immediate gratification with whatever it is that your immediate goal is. But sort of my 2 cents is like, don't forget about the long game. Like find a way to accomplish that goal that also sets you up for success moving forward. When it comes to distinguishing, the good information versus information that maybe isn't as good, we should probably do a whole nother episode on that because it's a big thing because people will quote research, people will highlight studies, they can sound right, they can have MD after their they can be all of these things that make you want to trust them as an expert. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the information that they're sharing is, objectively accurate, right? We'll do another episode on that. I'm just sort of thinking like there is it gets into a larger conversation of, research is something that not everyone has the experience or even the accessibility to really look at on their own. So it starts to become more understanding how to find, like, how to filter if what somebody's saying is sort of logically makes sense.
Yeah.
And, I can't remember his last name, Gil. He's a doctor that has a YouTube channel, and I'm blanking on it. I'll link to it below. But he has this method that's called the 3 Ps, which is proof. So if somebody makes a claim, there should be research attached to it. They bear the burden of proof. It is up to them to prove the point that they're making. So that's the first major red flag. If somebody's making health claims, like this supplement is great for X, Y, and Z, and there's just nothing. There's no research, nothing attached, that's on them. They need to be the ones to prove what they're saying. If there's not, you can basically just move on. That's probably not worth your time. So proof. The next P is pyramid, which is not all proof is created equal. There's different types of research. Something that's observational isn't as high quality as like a randomized control trial. We'll do an episode on this separately to talk about these different terms and what they mean. And the third is preponderance, which is this totality of evidence. You can cherry pick data to kind of tell you almost anything you want to see. There's papers that say that LDL isn't really associated with cardiovascular risk, but how those papers were done is questionable, and how it fits into the bigger picture is not even close. The vast amount of research on cardiovascular disease, including really high quality research and Mendelian randomization and all these other things, points toward a causal relationship between these two variables, LDL and cardiovascular events risk. So there's things you need to pay attention to. It's really hard. I feel like it's challenging, and it makes, and I feel for people who are trying to navigate this, and clever marketing tricks and people who should know better. It's unfortunate that there's a lot of unethical practice that happens in the social media environment, but we can talk about that in more detail coming up.
Yeah. This is a good segue into physical activity now.
Yeah, so physical activity is awesome. And this is the one that I struggle with most. So I could just live in the gym all day and pick things up and put them down, and then sit down for 5 minutes and then do it again. And
you don't want to do any cardio?
No. It's neat because our relationship with cardio has changed quite a bit over the last couple of years. One with doing Spartan races and it motivating us to start running more and hiking and getting on and doing those types of things, and Gus coming into our life, walking and playing outside with him and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, if you look at the recommendations around physical activity and cardiovascular risk, one of the big things that you're going to see is this cardiovascular activity. So the recommendation of 150 to 300 minutes, that isn't random. That comes from somewhere. Yeah. That is an evidence-based recommendation. And a lot of it is around this risk with cardiovascular disease. So it's nice to know that those recommendations are grounded in something. And it can be, some moderate, some vigorous, some sort of lower intensity cardio. Having a blend seems to be beneficial. But doing some of, even if it's like, high intensity, you just don't like it, it's just not your jam, and you want to do more moderate to low intensity stuff and get a little bit more, get that sort of close to that 300 minutes, great. If it's like, I don't have time for that, I'm just going to do like high intensity interval training type of stuff, great. Anything is better than nothing, and finding a way to incorporate it into your life that makes sense is wonderful. And for us, like even just daily steps are, there's quite a bit of evidence around getting closer to that 10,000 step mark. Even up to like 6,000 steps is super beneficial for reducing risk of cardiovascular disease, is great. Like for us, that's our main way of getting cardiovascular exercise. It's walking the dog. Yeah,
a huge help.
Yeah,
he gets us out a lot.
Yeah, right. And it's wonderful. Like before that, even as young people, we really didn't walk very much at all.
Yeah.
It's just so much easier to drive places, and we share a vehicle. Yeah, and we still.
I know when we moved into this house, because we're very central in town, we're like, well, we're going to walk everywhere. We did like 2 walks to the ice cream shop. We're like, huh. Yeah. So yeah, getting Gus, like he's been, we're out 2-3 times a day. It's actually, he's been a huge help for our health, which has been awesome.
Yeah, it's very cool. And I do need to highlight that resistance training or strength training is also super important.
For sure,
It can facilitate the process of being able to do cardiovascular exercise. Strong joints, strong bones, strong muscle can carry you along your way in your cardiovascular exercise. But there's even more, resistance training research is just pretty behind compared to cardiovascular research for a handful of reasons, but we're still sort of finding out more and more about the benefits of resistance training. So it's important not to forget that, but it's really important to remember that cardiovascular exercise is really one of these core things. And, some people will even argue that it is a more important factor than the nutrition altogether. Like, this is not something to sort of think that you can avoid, or that you can just kind of do these other things and not pay attention to. It really is one of like the most important. If you're going to weight them, arguably it could be the most important factor for reducing your risk. So super, super important. We're built to move, and we're made to move, and it's a beautiful thing though.
Let's go into lifestyle.
Yeah. So lifestyle, we'll keep it kind of concise, because lifestyle, we could get into all sorts of different things. And the lifestyle components, some of them are kind of related to the other two. Stress management is a really good example, because the physical activity that you participate in, improving the quality of your diet, those types of things are probably going to help with the stress management point. However, they might not solve it. You might still have to take actions to mitigate that. But stress management is also a really important thing. And I think sometimes we underestimate just how important it is. So stress management is a really big one. Sleep is another one that the reason we laugh is I don't sleep good. I have a really hard time with this. This is probably the number one thing that I could work on. Cardiovascular exercise too. I could do more of that. But the sleep thing is something that, I really could put more focus into, and I'm really hoping that I can improve, because it is, you can do all these other things right. And again, if you're just getting really poor sleep for many, many years, that's a problem. And it also contributes to this stress reduction piece and to the others. If you sleep well, there's data that supports that you make better dietary decisions. Gus is playing by the camera again. You make better dietary decisions, and you'll be more energized to participate in physical activity. So sleep is another one of these ones that can influence the others. And then the rest are like, don't smoke, moderate to low alcohol consumption, things like, BMI, so your body composition, those types of things. And yeah, those are sort of the main components. And that Essential 8 document that we'll link has these in much greater detail.
Cool. So yeah, for us in our life, so for each of the, like those three, for like nutrition wise, we're doing plant-based, trying to like kind of go towards more of the portfolio diet. Physical activity, our schedules are kind of crazy right now. You're doing a little bit more than I am right now. I'm trying to hit like 3 days a week of strength training. We're walking every day with Gus. Like that's helpful. You're doing, are you doing 5 days? Trying to get 5 days?
Yeah, it
around
depends.
4 or 5?
Yeah, it just depends on how I feel. If I'm sore, how well rested I am, and different things. But 4 to 5 days of strength training a week, and then pretty much walking every day because of Gus.
Yeah. And then as far as like the lifestyle, so like sleep and stress, we're trying to focus on like boundaries and learning how to say no, not taking on too much to lower our stress and just have better work-life balance. And then with sleep, whatever time we go to bed, we really try to be in bed for 8 hours. So if it's a little bit later, we set the alarm a little bit later, or we try to be in bed earlier and get up earlier. So we're trying. It's hard in life, like to find that balance, but every day we're just going to try to keep working at it and have healthy hearts.
Yeah.
Hopefully.
And that's the thing, right? Like you do the best that you can, because you also don't want the process to become a stressful thing all in itself, right?
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
It's making it fun. It's making it work with your life and your schedule, and no two people are the same. And that's the nice thing of there being these multiple modifiable factors, right? Like some might be really in check and some might not be, and that might change over the course of time and where you're at in your life. And you just, make it fun and do the best that you can. And it's one of those things. I do just want to just briefly mention that like plant-based and portfolio aren't mutually exclusive. That's one of the nice things, is that both can be encompassed. It's, again, portfolio is more about what you're adding in. So a plant-based diet with a portfolio spin, for kind of lack of better terms. And the sleep hygiene thing, oh boy.
I know.
Yeah, there's lots that we can, we do a pretty good job of like the 8 hours in bed, but there's still a lot of things that we could work on. So this is our way of
There's
keeping
always
ourselves
always
accountable.
room for improvement.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Before we wrap up this episode, do you have any final thoughts?
I think we covered a lot of it. Like the one thing that sort of came to mind that I wanted to mention was just that social media piece. But we covered that. We've talked a lot about the prevalence, the risk factors, how this all goes down. I think we're pretty good. If we need to, let us know your questions, because we can do a part 2. I'd be more than happy to do a part 2 that can be either more on the practical end or more on the nerdy end. I'm okay with that too.
And if you guys are also in this deep, dark hole, let us know your thoughts. And if you have any tips or tricks that you're doing, share them with us. We'd love to hear them. Any questions or thoughts can be sent to hello@jessiebourgeois.com. And we'll get back to you and see you next time.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye.